right, cool. So my talk is, I want to make sure this works. Okay, cool. So my talk is about getting kind of down and dirty with the Docker API. So as a disclaimer, this is for version 1.16, which I think is still the latest. I'm anticipating that these slides will live forever on the internet, so I want to make sure that like people don't find me and yell at me like, you're totally wrong, they fixed that. And I'm like, well, okay. So, so basically, I work for Chef, and for a very long time I was working on a lot of Docker-related Chef projects that at the time all used the CLI to communicate with the API. So basically, if you wanted to use Chef to manage your Docker containers or something like that, you would use like one of those projects. But the challenge was that, specifically for Chef provisioning, that it needed the CLI. And that wasn't always going to be the case, that the machine where the Chef run was executing would have Docker on it. So I couldn't depend on the CLI, so I needed to talk to the API. So basically, the process of moving all of these things from talking to the CLI to moving to the API was a lot more difficult than I anticipated, because Docker documentation was not awesome. Surprise, surprise. Essentially, the way, like, it doesn't, like, if you're very familiar with using the CLI, moving straight into using the API was, like, really, really different. So it kind of forced me to figure out, all right, so I'm going to have a whole bunch of user input, and those users are probably going to be familiar with using the CLI, but I need to write things to the API, so what am I going to do? And the result was this PR to the Docker API Ruby gem, which you can take a look at. And basically, the TL, too long didn't listen. I wrote a Ruby class that will convert CLI input into API input. So you can like take a CLI string, pop it in this class, and it will create an object that you can pass directly into the API. And it's a lot nicer than the Docker Go stuff because it's all in one place. So why would you want to use the API? Well, let's say you don't have access or permissions to the shell or to install Docker. Like maybe that's a situation where the application that's actually parsing the input doesn't have access to the shell. Or you can't install Docker natively on the thing. Maybe you have an iOS app or an Android app where you want to be able to like push a button on your or like use Siri, like give me 600 containers, and it would spin up 600 containers. Or Windows or OS X where you need a VM. So if you're running anything natively on those applications, you don't have the CLI necessarily. And also, you're not shelling out, which means no shell vulns. Yay! So basically, tips to get started with the API. If you take nothing else from this talk, take from these. Keep an eye on the remote documentation. Docker has the habit of releasing things in the API that they don't announce in their blog posts. There was, I think, probably 2 or 3 things that they changed in their API from 1.15 to 1.16 that they didn't announce in the blog. Like I actually had to go to the API documentation and look and like, oh, hey, they did the thing. And also, don't write it from scratch. Use existing libraries. That's a mess. Like, unless you know how to do HTTP session hijacking, don't even just use the existing libraries. So basically, the rest of the talk is going to be me talking about all the things that piss me off. So basically, the CLI does a lot of validation and transformation on the data that you pass into it before it passes it to the API, and that's the toughest. Yeah, that is like, it's not documented, and you have to like go into the Go code to like, oh, okay, so I'm gonna go into this file. That's not the right file. So you like do a GitHub search and get 1 million results, and then you're like, okay, cool, I found the thing, and it points you to this other file that you don't know where that one is either. So not only do you have to learn Go, but you have to learn the Docker like library structure so that you can figure out how they're parsing this goddamn string. So that was a pain in the ass. So the gotcha number 1, those fun names that you get, those are generated by the CLI. So if you're using the API, you need to specify your own name. That's fun. The command and entry point, like when you actually like create an API request for the command and the entry point, those have to be shell word arrays. So when I say shell word, like the Bourne shell expects the string to be meaningful, and there's ways to parse that. So you can't put your huge command in one big string, because it will try to execute that as it'll look for a binary named that, and it won't exist. So you have to be able to parse that. I say have to. All indications on what I found says this is the case, but I haven't actually been able to confirm with a double-blind study. So for the most part, that's true. Device mapping. When you specify in the CLI, you get these nice little things: host path, container path, and permissions. However, there is a mapping that they didn't document in their API. It's devices and then an empty hash. And I'm like, what am I supposed to put in that hash when I have a device? This is one of the things I had to go into the Go code to figure out. That and the default permissions. I couldn't find the default permissions anywhere on the documentation. I finally found it, I think randomly in the CLI output. It was I think that's it. So, environment files. So you get to pass in fun parse this file. When using the CLI, you just point to a file. Yeah. You're going to have to parse that, go iterate through each line, and validate that it's a correctly constructed variable declaration yourself. So yeah, exposing ports. The whole ranges thing, being able to specify a range, that's the CLI. You have to go through and individually iterate every single port that you want to expose in that range. I hope you like loops. And you also have to specify the protocols. So you have to know that TCP is the default. Once again, none of that stuff was actually documented on the remote API documentation. Memory. You get to specify oh, I want 2 gigs of memory. Yeah, the API only accepts bytes. So you have to do the math to figure that out. And if you're like me and you can never remember, is it 1,000 or 1024? Whatever. So that was me at 10 o'clock at night dealing with this. All right, so publishing ports. This is fun. So a single CLI input is peppered all over the API. So you have the IP, the host port, the container port, and the protocol, once again. So one place it goes into the exposed ports, where you set the container port and the protocol as the key, and then the value to be an empty hash. I still don't know if there's anything that's supposed to go into that hash, or if it's just empty. And then in another place, you actually have to take host config port bindings, and then that same thing, and that's where you set the host port and the IP port and the host config. So once again, if I didn't know, I kind of assumed through trial and error that I had to do both of this, but I had to actually look in the code to figure out yeah, okay, it does that stuff. Volumes, once again, taking a volume, peppers it all over the API. So IP host, that's the wrong one. Copy and paste error. The next page is right. Anyways, so if you specify one volume, just I want to create a volume in the container at this place, then that's one thing. Once again, empty hash, don't know why. But if you specify host and container, that's 2 places where you have the empty hash and then an array with the string. So, that was a month and a half of my life to figure this out. So I think I gave most of that to you in 10 minutes. So, you can send me the money that the difference there. I'll totally take that money. Yeah, that was really quick. Questions? Yes. See, I knew. They're in a Google Drive. I am anticipating that I will turn them into a PDF and post them somewhere. The really important bit, really is this Ruby class. That's where I spent a lot of time on this class. It is the most beautifully crafted piece of Ruby code that I think I have ever created in my life. I documented this more than I think I documented most things ever. So like, this is the thing you want to check out, but I will post the slides. All right, cool. So we're going to do questions for both Bridget and me now.